My name is Scott Farber. I am here to introduce you to Pat Quigley. Pat is an international marketing superstar. This man from New York turned the country music world upside down when he landed in Nashville, Tennessee, after a phone call from Garth Brooks. Meet my friend, a great storyteller. This is the Pat Quigley Podcast.
Thanks, Scott. Well, folks, we really thought we should just have a little conversation today. Scott's right. I'm probably not great, but I'm old, so I've seen a lot of things, and Scott thought it'd be fun to share some of them with you. The first one we're going to start with is maybe my life in country music. As a New York City kid, it was surprising when the phone rang. I was working for EMI Capitol Records in New York, and I had a corner office overlooking the Christmas tree in Rockefeller Center on the 42nd floor of a building. Phone rings and says, "Are you the marketing guy?" And I guess no one ever asked me that question before. And I said, "Well, I suppose I am." He said, "My name is Garth Brooks." I said, "Well, I've heard of you." We both had a little laugh. And he said, "Can you come see me tomorrow?" I said, "Sure." "Where are you?" And he said, "I'm in Nashville." I said, "Okay." So I went into my boss, Charles Koppelman, who is the chairman of EMI Capital in the United States. I said, "Hey, Garth wants me to come down and see him tomorrow, so I'm going to head down." And Charles said, I'm the only person anyone's ever heard of where Charles said, "Take my plane." Charles had a beautiful plane. So I said, "Sure." So I flew down to see Garth on a private jet and went over to his house and sat down. And he actually has a book coming out right now. And in the book, he said, when I first met Pat, New York City marketing guy, I was ready to say, no, 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 no. And in truth, he said, yes, 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 yes. Before I headed down to see Garth, Charles Koppelman said to me, "Could you find out if you can get a greatest hits album from Garth?" And Garth had already said no to Charles, and Charles's boss, Jim Fifield in London, also asked him. Garth said no. So my first meeting with Garth, I sat down and I said, "Garth, you know what the problem in the music business is?" And Garth, the way he tells in the book, he said, "No, Pat, tell me, what's the problem with the music business?" I said, "If you don't buy the album today, you'll get it tomorrow. There's no urgency in the business." And in my life, my whole point was always get it today because it's really important that you own it. And so Garth said, "Okay, that's a good start." And so we talked for a while, and it looked like we were going to be friends. And then I said, "Garth, I know you don't want to do a greatest hits album, but Charles and Jim need it for the year. So listen to this. Suppose we put a greatest hits album out, and I think your point is if you put a greatest hits album, it's going to kill all the other, which is why buy the album? You just get the hits. You don't need the rest of the albums." And Garth always cares about the songwriter. So if all you have is one of the 3 or 4 mega hits, all the album cuts wouldn't make any money anymore. Garth really cares about songwriters. So I said, "No, here's my thought. We'll put out a greatest hits album for 6 months, and then we'll take it off the market, never be released again." And he just sat there and he said, "Okay, how many will we sell?" His current album was at 1.5 million units. And I said, "How many will we sell?" 10 million. He looked at me and said, 10 million? I said, "I'll tell you what, tell Koppelman to guarantee me 7 million and I'll give you the album." Remember, 6 months. So, all right. Well, Garth hands me his cell phone and I call up Koppelman. I said, "Charles, I'm here with Garth." And I told Garth, I know already that he said no to hits. And we may have an idea, but you said if there's anything special, I should call you. And Charles said, "Okay." And Charles was a great cigar smoker. And so you could hear him on the other end of the phone. I said, "Well, the first thing I said was we'd guarantee him 7 million units. And you hear Charles take the cigar out and says, "Wait a minute." 2 seconds later, I want you to know I'm on this job for 2 months. 2 seconds later, Jim Fifield's on the phone from London in the middle of the night. Charles Koppelman's on the phone in New York, and I'm here with Garth Brooks, and I don't know a damn thing about music industry. I'm a marketing guy, but nothing about music. So Charles says, "Why don't you tell Jim what your point is?" I said, "Well, Jim, I'm sitting here with Garth, and he'll give us the hits. There's just 2 contingencies. The first is we guarantee him 7 million units." Charles said, "Where do we recoup? Where do we break even?" And I said, 4.2 million. He goes, "Do it." I said, "Well, wait, don't hang up, guys. There's only one more point." And you hear Charles with a cigar. And he said, "What else?" I said, we can only sell the record for 6 months. And you hear the cigar fly out of his mouth. He goes, 6 months? Are you out of your blanking mind? And I hear Jim laughing in London. And Jim knew who I was because he's a big skier, and I have a big history in the ski business. And and Jim says, "Hey Pat, can you do it?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Do it," and it was over. And the long and the short of the story is, we put the hits out. If you know Garth, it's a red, white, and blue face on this album, and it was called The Hits. We put it out, and we sold 10 million in 6 months, and took it off the market, and never to come back again. So that was my introduction to Garth Brooks, and kind of my introduction to country music. And and then we did that, and I was in New York, and he said, "Okay, I think everybody in Nashville has kind of learned from our last lesson, so we'll call you if you need anything." Great. So they put the next album out, and it does a couple million units. And Garth's like, "What happened? We just did 10 million. Why are we only doing a couple million?" So the next phone call is, "How about moving to Nashville?" And I remember Charles asking me, "Would you move to Nashville?" I said, "Well, Charles, to be honest, I'm really a New York City guy, so if that's where the job is, I'll just do something else." He said, "No, no, no, you have your job, but Garth really needs you." And so I told my wife, and she just smiled and said, "I'd love to live in Nashville." And I knew I was dead. So within a short period of time, I moved to Nashville. So now you have a New York City kid who's not a music guy, nor would ever pretend to be a music guy. But the reason I'm in marketing is I care about the consumer. So Charles did tell me on my way down, he goes, "Remember, Garth is the first product that's going to have an opinion. A Rolling Rock beer never had an opinion. A Lang ski boot never had an opinion. But an artist is going to have an opinion." And so I moved down, and the first magazine that did a story of me was called the Nashville Scene. And the Nashville Scene is kind of the Village Voice of Nashville. And they take my picture, and I always remember it was blood red. The covers, it's a black and white, but there's blood red. They print and it says, "Will this man ruin Music Row?" And I was like, wow, this is going to be a long, a long, hard journey for me. Yeah, Nashville just didn't want a New York City kid running, with Garth, the biggest label in country music. And I really did understand it, and I took it all kind of tongue in cheek, and so I come down here, and it was clear that nobody was going to welcome me, and that was fine. And that's not really true. Joe Galante was a New York City guy who ran Nashville, and he was always very nice to me. And so the attacks were coming, and who cares? Like, it didn't mean anything to me. So what I did was, if you're old enough to remember McDonald's, it would say 10 million sold, 20 million sold. They kept changing the number. So I took the biggest billboard in Nashville when I put the hits out, and it's called a snipe in the corner. It said 1 million sold. It's the first album to ever sell to retail 1 million units in 1 week. It was the first album to ever do that. It said 1 million. Next week it said 2 million. Next week it said 3 million. And it was just pissing everybody off. And I kind of felt bad after I did it, but it was my way of saying, why don't you just run your business? I'll run mine, and everybody be happy. Like, we don't have to, we don't have to work together. If you don't want to work with a New York City kid, that's fine. And that kind of launched the music. And then a couple of years later, I said to Garth, digital music's coming, and I had really great friends in the digital world, especially at Apple. And it was clear that it was the end of physical music. CDs, vinyl was already kind of gone, and CDs were about to go away. And I said, I got an idea. There's a lot of people that don't have all your albums. Why don't we make up a box set, put all the albums in at a good price? I think it was maybe $39.95 kind of list price, and get 6 albums. And Garth said, "How many are we going to sell?" I said, "Well, I can't remember. I think it was like Pink Floyd was at 1.7 million after 30 years. I said, why don't we try to do 2 million in 30 days? Now, Garth is the athlete above all. So if you say to Garth, here's a challenge, you got a much better chance of doing something than if it's just run of the mill. He never wants to do anything run of the mill. So he says, 2 million box sets in 30 days. He says, okay, let's do it. So same phone call to Charles. He's like, all right. And the sales guys were like, the first time they said, we're out of your mind, never going to do it. The second time we're going to say, you're out of your mind, but you might do it. And as the sales guy says, and then the third time we called him saying, what do you got this year? So we're going to try to do 2 million box sets in 30 days. And the box set at 30 something dollars debuted #1 on the singles chart. So compared to any one album in America, we sold more Garth box sets. I think the first week in the box set might have been 600,000 or 700,000. at whatever the price was. And at that moment, we became really good friends with a man named Bill Lardy who ran Anderson Merchandising, which is Walmart Music. It was Walmart Music and Books, but for us it was only music. And and Bill said, I'm an athlete. I'd like to, whatever you and Garth are doing, please include me in. And he became just a magnificent friend for Garth and I, and by extension, so did Walmart. And I'm not going to use names, but I remember being at Walmart and somebody comes down and they thank me and everything. I walk around and say, "Who is it?" And she says, "That's the president of Walmart." And I'm like, I didn't even know who it was. But what I liked about Walmart, one is, if you know anything about Garth Brooks, he always has a great value. His ticket prices were always much lower than anybody else's because he knows country music fans don't have as much money, let's say, as in New York City, somebody going to, Carnegie Hall. So he always cared about the songwriter and he always cared about the fan and he always, therefore, always cared about the price. And so my point to EMI Capital was, let's make our money in volume and not on the individual album. And because Charles and Jim, they got it. I mean, they understood what we were doing. They supported them all the way. And so I don't think Garth and I ever sold less than 10 million albums, anything we ever put out. And we buried the hits master in front of the Capitol building in LA on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood, if you know what that is. Garth has a star, and under the star is buried the master for the hits, just so we'd never put it out again, just so everybody understood that. That album, I think, is certified in total at maybe 21 or 22 million albums, which is what it ended up doing by the time we buried the master. So I think, if I'm right, it's still the biggest selling RIAA country music album of all time. And then somewhere in there is the number 2 album, which I think he's tied maybe with Shania at 18 million for No Fences. But soon the digital revolution came, and the rest of the world was, criticizing us because we sold 6 albums for 30 or 40 bucks. And they guess they didn't realize, but the fans all got a chance at a great price to get his whole collection. And that kind of, Garth believes it solidified the relationship with his fans. And years later, if you guys are aware, I told a story in another book. I said, I had read a book about Aristotle Onassis. And in the book, he had no oil and he had no ships. But after World War II, he had great friends in America who knew the United States was going to boom and they needed oil from the Middle East. He goes to the Middle East and says, I control all the ships. He had nothing. I control all the ships in Greece. Give me the contracts. They gave him the contracts. He then went to Greece and said, I control all the oil. Give me the ships. And they gave him the ships. And that's how he became the richest man in the world at the time. So I went to New York City. I walked into Giuliani's office and said, I have Garth Brooks. And this is an election year. I'd like to do a concert in Central Park. Giuliani was on top of his game. And he said, go see Henry Stern, the Parks Commissioner, and tell him I want to do it. I said, okay, good. By the time I got there, he knew what it was. And Henry Stern was a wonderful character. He had a beautiful golden retriever, and I was a golden retriever owner also, and a little clicker. As soon as you pet the dog, he goes in his pocket, click, you go. He goes, this is the most pet dog in Guinness Book of Records. Every time you pet it, I click it again, so we keep a record of how many times this dog's getting clicked. So I knew I loved the guy already. And I lived at 79th and Columbus in New York City, which is a block away from Central Park. So I explained what I wanted, and he wanted a certain amount of money. I said, that's not going to work for us. We're trying to do something for free and nothing commercial about it. So he said, okay, I'll take care of that. We cut the price, and I called up Rick Ludwin, who was our friend at NBC, who took care of nighttime and specials for NBC. And Rick said, I'm always with you guys. Oh, whatever you need, I'm with you. But he said, Pat, this is an HBO special. This Garth Brooks in Central Park is HBO all over it. So I said, okay. So he said, I'll call Jeff Bucas. And that was the guy who ran HBO, and Nancy Geller. And so I got in a cab and I went down, I think it was like 42nd and 6th, went up to the top floor, and there they were. And we sat down. It took 2 seconds. And they said, you're clearly a New York City guy. We get it. Garth in the Park. I said, that's what it is, Garth in the Park. They said, we'll take it. And they gave us, an unbelievable amount of money. And Garth said, I want none of the money. I want everything to go in to let people, to producing and promoting the show, so it's the best show New York City's ever seen. And if anybody was there, if you ever see the video of it, it's spectacular. And I guess the fire department looked at me and said, if we look at how many people we can put, on a blanket there's over 1 million people here. And I don't know what the final tally was. I think it's 1,000,001. And their answer was, Pat, remember, if Paul Simon and the Pope did X, Garth did 2X or 3X. We don't really know what the number is, but 1,000,000's a good number to go with. So, but it's certainly the biggest concert in New York history. And and we did it. And after the show, Garth and I sat down and we were going to have dinner. I said, "Well, how was it?" And he goes, "I want to tell you the truth, Pat. I can't remember." He said, "I walked out there. You can't imagine what it looks like to walk out and see a million people. And farther than the eye could see was people. They took down all the backstops, if you know Central Park at all. It just went forever, and it was from one side of the park to the other side of the park. And I just looked and said, "Welcome to New York." He did a magnificent job, and Billy Joel came and helped us out, and he sang a couple of great New York songs, and it was one of the great nights. I was always more proud to be a New Yorker, but on that night, I was really proud to be a friend of Garth Brooks, and from that kind of led to marketing. So if any of you are marketing students, if you find out why Budweiser was so successful, you realize how we did Garth, which is if you can't sell it in New York, in Chicago, and LA, you can't do the kind of units we're talking about because that's where people live. So if you treat country music like Deliverance and it's only going to sell in Southern Alabama, well, you're going to get those kind of sales. I believed, I'm a New York City kid, and at the end of Long Island is a place called the Hamptons. Everybody goes out there and spends their summers out there. I believe that in the summer, you could certainly have what I called town and country music. It happens to be the name of a Ford dealer in here. That's where I got the name. And so town and country was maybe you don't normally listen to country music, but in the summer, it's a lot of fun. So if you're out at the pool party and you put a Garth Brooks song on at a pool party, it's staggering how many people can sing Friends in Low Places. No matter where you live, you know that song. And so we started marketing in New York, in Chicago, and LA. And Scott Farber, the guy who introduced me, was the media genius behind it that said, "I only have X amount of money. Can you get me 10X?" And he created a buy for us. And we made great friends with NBC. These are the days of Seinfeld and ER and Friends. And so they would always call me and say, "Okay, if you're doing a Garth special, I'll give you all those shows for the price of one." And for a record label, even in those days, it would have been $10 million, and for us, it might have cost us $1 million or something. And I would take care of the major markets with NBC, and Scott would create a buy for us in the top 100 other markets, and everyone who was a potential Garth fan saw at least 3 commercials, and that was kind of our model. Is let's reach 95% of our target audience at least 3 times. And all our job was to create an awareness of Garth. And Garth's point was, if my music doesn't hold a day, I won't hold it against you guys. That's your job, is to create awareness. My job is to create demand with the product. And I think everything we did was kind of successful because, first of all, because it's Garth Brooks. So when people say to me, "I'm going to write a book about your time with Garth Brooks," I said, "Wait, no, I can't take any credit. Selling Garth Brooks is like selling a cure for the worst disease in the world. It's too easy." Historically, I got a call from the Beatles committee and said, "Can you do the same thing for the Beatles you do for Garth Brooks?" And the answer was, in fact, yes. I can't say you do that for everybody, but yeah, the Beatles and Garth Brooks are Mount Rushmore. And so on the Beatles anthology, that's the TV series we did with ABC. We worked on that one and we used advertising. And on Beatles ones, I got a phone call from Ken Berry, who replaced Jim Fifield, and said, "If I give you the Beatles albums to market out of Nashville instead of LA, how many will you sell?" Beatles ones, which is their greatest hits. I said, 10 million. His wife said, because I've already done it. And the Beatles and Garth are the same thing. So 10 million. He said, "Be in LA tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock." I walked into the Capitol Tower. If you know the Capitol building now, it's a really famous building. And I walked in and there were 17 people in the room. I was like, wow, no wonder these people, are looking for somebody like me, because committees never work, at least for me. So we sat down and I realized I didn't want to make anybody feel bad. So I said, "Guys, I think that we work differently and see if this will work for you. Does anybody have a budget of $10 million for TV?" And they all laughed and said, "Okay, you don't." So suppose we said, "You have a budget of $10 million. Would you spend it on TV?" "Yeah." I said, "Okay." So that's how easy it is for us to work. And we became friends. And we did 11 million of the Beatles. It took us a year, not 6 months, but we still did 11 million of the Ones album. And it was I don't remember the lawyer's name, but I had done the trick once before with the EMI sales team where I look and say, I'm surprised you don't want to do advertising. It was something like that. And the guy said, well, of course we want to do advertising. Oh, then we'll be fine. And they never bothered me. Everything we wanted to do was fine. So I think the music industry didn't believe in marketing. They believed in radio airplay, that if it's a radio hit, it'll sell. I remember somebody saying the nice thing about the Beatles and Garth, you don't have to advertise them. They're really famous. And it turns out if you have a famous product, it's the opposite. You have to advertise twice as much, but the return is tenfold. So if you advertise a really successful product, you get a lot of money back. And if you don't advertise the product, you'll keep the product because nobody will know it's even out there. So,
Pat, let's wrap it up today with a quick story about Chris Gaines.
okay. Um, Garth really believes country music is really special. And he believes that country radio needs to be protected. And at the time, country stars were all figuring out how can I cross over to pop, especially the women. Garth said, I'll never take the name Garth Brooks to pop radio. It's country. I'd rather bring pop people to country than country people to pop. So we had a chance to work on a movie project called the Life of Chris Gaines. And it was kind of a pseudo rock star. And the album was produced by Don Was, who for me is still the greatest living producer of music. And if you're a Bonnie Raitt fan, Nick of Time and Luck of the Draw, you know who Don Was is. And some of the Beach Boys and Hootie and the Blowfish, he did some of that. But he has a wonderful feel for the artist and the music, so he could work with Garth. And he called me and said, Pat, the music is so diverse with uh, Chris Gaines that I suggest we call this the greatest hits of Chris Gaines, because in the movie is going to cover a whole lifetime of an artist anyway. So this could be a whole series of products. So that's how it became the greatest hits. Was really named by Don Was, and so he put it together. And his point was, I like Garth never needed some pseudo name in the background. He wanted to protect country radio, so he wasn't working as a third person. He was protecting country radio. So we did the project and we took it out to pop radio, and some of the songs pop radio liked, and they played those songs and didn't play others. And so we sold 2 million albums like in no time. And then I went to Garth and said, Garth, let's treat this like the hits and let's pull it. And that's why I said, you accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. You sold a rock album. I think it was like the 10th or 11th biggest selling album of the year. I promise it wasn't out for a month, and we hit our number. And, Garth was always good. Now that you mention that, he's like, you're the boss. And I remember calling him after I had Central Park and HBO and said, Garth, I have Central Park and HBO. I need an artist. And he said, you're the boss. And that's how simple Central Park was. And it was the same thing with Chris Gaines, which was, if you're satisfied, Pat, I'm satisfied. So we put it out. It got everything we wanted out of it. And he protected country radio, which was kind of his objective. So,
Yeah, and you brought it to Saturday Night Live.
yeah, the trick there was to say, remember, that'd be Rick Ledwin again. So, Rick, how about Garth is the first host and Chris Gaines is the musical guest? Lotus said, you guys drive me crazy. So he laughed a little bit and he said, all right, let's do it. And so we did it. And so Garth did he does all the great comedy skits. And I remember Lauren Michael saying to me, you know what I like Garth Brooks? I said, no, he goes, he takes possession of the content. Like, even if it isn't funny, he said, the funniest lines we have in Saturday Night Live are the ones that didn't work. But the artist said it so seriously that everybody laughs hysterically. And he said, Garth always does that. So he performed this Chris Gaines, whatever the radio hit was, and he did all the skits as Garth Brooks. We really always enjoyed Saturday Night Live. Also for us, it was Jay Leno. People don't realize, I believe Garth was the first and last guest ever in the history of Jay Leno's Tonight Show.
Pat, are you ever going to get Garth to bring Chris Gaines back?
I don't know that Garth would do it. Like for Garth, when once a project's successful, he moves on. Like he got 20 years worth of ideas in his head. So I don't know that he would ever go back and do something twice. I just don't know if that would ever be interesting to him. And maybe I don't want to speak for him, but let me put it this way: it wouldn't be my idea. But if he wanted to do it, we'd do it.